She scrubbed frozen sheets in the dark while the town slept warm, and nobody saw her. Nobody ever did. Clara May Whitlock had been invisible to Red Hollow Valley for so long that she had almost convinced herself she preferred it that way. Almost. Then one morning, without warning or invitation, a shadow fell across the riverbank where she worked, and the man standing in that shadow did not look away. He did not flinch. He did not smirk. He simply watched her with the kind of quiet attention that a person gives to something they consider worthy of their time. In a single ordinary moment, everything Clara believed about her place in this world began to tremble. Stay with me, friends. Drop your city in the comments below and do not leave before this story is finished. The cold came early to Red Hollow Valley that year. It arrived not with the gradual forgiving fade of autumn, but with the sudden merciless certainty of a door slamming shut on everything warm and living. By the third week of October, the river that wound along the eastern edge of town had grown a thin skin of ice at its shallows, and the cottonwood trees on the far bank stood stripped and pale against a sky the color of old pewter. The ground was hard underfoot. The wind, when it moved down from the ridgeline, carried in it a cutting edge that found every gap in every layer of clothing and settled against the skin like a punishment. Clara May Whitlock was already at the river by the time that wind began its morning work. She had been there since well before first light, when the darkness was still total, and the only sounds were the slow, reluctant murmur of the current beneath the ice and the rhythmic, relentless sound of her own labor. She worked by feel and by memory, her hands moving through a routine so deeply ingrained that her mind was free to wander to other darker places while her body continued its task without complaint. The wash was heavy this week. Mrs. Alderman up on the hill had sent down 3 sets of her formal table linens along with her husband's dress shirts, each one starched and ironed to her precise specifications. The Hendersons from the dry goods store had added 2 woolen blankets and a set of curtains to the pile. Old Reverend Marsh, who paid less than anyone and was always the first to complain, had contributed a bundle of his robes and surplices that smelled of candle smoke and damp. Clara sorted them without resentment and without enthusiasm, because resentment, like grief, was a luxury that required energy she could not afford to spend. She was a powerfully built woman, Clara May, with the kind of frame that spoke not of excess, but of endurance. Her shoulders were broad and level, the shoulders of someone who had been carrying things for so long that the act of carrying had become architectural, had shaped the very bones of her. Her hands, submerged now in the basin of frigid river water she had hauled and prepared before dawn, were large and capable. The knuckles reddened and cracked from the cold and the lye soap, the palms calloused in precise patterns that mapped every tool she had ever wielded, every rope she had ever pulled, every piece of work she had ever forced herself to finish. She was 32 years old. Her face, when the pale, early light finally began to gather at the horizon, was striking in its stillness. Dark lashed eyes set beneath a broad, thoughtful forehead, a mouth that was generous when it was not pressed into the flat, careful line it wore most often, now a jaw that set itself against the cold with the same determined immovability it set against everything else. She did not think of herself as beautiful. She had been taught with considerable thoroughness not to. The tent she slept in was pitched 30 yards back from the riverbank, half hidden by a stand of scrub willows that provided some windbreak in summer and precious little in October. It was a large canvas wall tent, army surplus, patched in 4 places with pieces of different colored canvas that she had sewn on herself with waxed thread. Inside, she had organized her small world with the precision of someone who understood that chaos was a form of surrender. Her washboard and her 2 large iron-banded tubs occupied one side. Her sleeping pallet, a narrow affair of folded blankets over a frame of lashed branches, occupied the other. A small iron stay, the single greatest luxury she possessed, sat in the center with a length of flue pipe she had run through a fitted hole in the canvas roof. When the wood held out, the stove kept the tent survivable. When it did not, she slept in her coat. She had lived this way for 3 years. Before that, she had rented a room above the feed store from old Mr. Pickett, who had been a decent and incurious landlord, and who had died of a chest ailment 2 winters ago, after which his nephew had arrived from somewhere east of the mountains and tripled the rent inside of a month. Clara had paid the new rate for as long as she could, cutting her own food to almost nothing, working her fingers past the point of pain, and then she had accepted with the same quiet, resolute grace with which she accepted most of the hard things in her life that the room was no longer possible. She had erected the tent on the riverbank on a narrow strip of land that belonged to no one in particular, and she had told herself that it was temporary. She had stopped telling herself that somewhere in the first winter, the work that sustained her was washing and mending. She was known among the households that employed her for an absolute reliability and a quality of workmanship that was difficult to fault even for those who were inclined to find fault. Mrs. Alderman, who was inclined to find fault in most things, had once told her neighbor that the Whitlock woman did the finest ironing in the valley, and this admission, extracted so reluctantly from a woman not given to praise, had traveled through the town's social networks and kept Clara's order book full, even in the slow months. She was also known, though this was spoken of less directly, for her discretion. She saw the household linens of half the prominent families in Red Hollow, and she knew from the evidence of her washtub more about the private lives of those families than any of them would have been comfortable acknowledging. She kept what she knew to herself. It was not a choice she made out of calculation, but out of a deep instinctive sense that the private suffering of others was not hers to traffic in, because she understood from the inside what it meant to have your suffering become public entertainment. That understanding had a specific origin. It had a date and a place and a name. The date was the 14th of April, 3 years ago. The place was the town square of Red Hollow on a warm spring Saturday, when half the valley had come in for market day and the other half had come in for the simple pleasure of seeing their neighbors. The name was Silas Dowd. She did not think about Silas Dowd if she could help it. This morning, with her hands in freezing water and the darkness still thick around her, she could not entirely help it. The memory surfaced the way bad memories do not all at once, but in pieces, each piece sharp enough on its own. She remembered the way the crowd had gone quiet. She remembered the particular quality of that quiet, how it was not the quiet of shock, but the quiet of an audience that has been waiting for exactly this and is now settling in to watch. She remembered standing in the square in her good dress, the blue one she had saved for 3 months, to afford holding a basket of preserves she had made herself as a small ordinary gesture of love, because she had believed with the complete and unguarded trust of a person who has not yet learned to protect themselves from exactly this, that Silas Dowd loved her back. He had been standing with a group of his friends, and she had seen before he turned to face her the way a certain look passed between those friends, a look that was the social equivalent of a coiling spring. And then he had turned, and he had spoken loudly enough for the square to hear, and what he had said had been designed with a specific surgical cruelty to do the maximum possible damage in the shortest possible time. He had questioned her right to imagine that someone like him could ever seriously consider someone like her. He had made reference to her size with the casual contempt of a man who has never had to choose between eating and paying rent, who has never had to carry his own world on his own back. He had mentioned to the amusement of his companions that he had recently become engaged to Annalise Pruitt, who was small and fine-boned, and the daughter of the valley's most prosperous banker, and that some men preferred a more refined sort of companionship. He had laughed. Others had laughed with him. Clara had not cried. Not there. She had stood for a moment that felt very long, holding her basket of preserves, and then she had turned and walked away from the square with her back straight and her head level, and she had not let herself run until she was around the corner and out of sight. And even then, it had been a brief, controlled thing, because running like crying was a form of vulnerability she could not afford to display. She had not returned to the square for 6 weeks. When she finally did, she returned with the specific silent determination of a person who has decided that the world does not get to have the satisfaction of seeing them disappear. She did her marketing. She collected and delivered her washing. She held her head at the same careful angle. And if the social invitations that had occasionally come her way before the square incident no longer came, she told herself she had never placed much stock in them anyway. Her mother had said nothing that helped. Eleanor Whitlock, who lived in a tidy house on the respectable side of town and attended the Presbyterian church every Sunday without fail, and cared more for the opinion of her neighbors than for almost any other thing in her life, had taken Clara aside shortly after the incident in the square, and told her, with the particular kindness of someone who believes they are being realistic rather than cruel, that perhaps Clara ought to consider how she presented herself, that perhaps certain expectations were not reasonable given certain realities, that perhaps it would be better for everyone, including Clara herself, if she kept a lower profile. Eleanor Whitlock had not used the words her daughter was used to hearing from others, but the substance of what she communicated was identical, and it had landed with the additional force of coming from the one person in the world whose approval Clara had never entirely stopped wanting. She had not been to her mother's house in 14 months. The river current moved sluggishly beneath the ice at the shallows. Clara lifted a soaked shirt from the basin and began to work it against the washboard with the methodical, even pressure of long practice. The cold was deep enough now that her fingers had passed through the phase of pain into a kind of numbness that was almost peaceful, though she knew from experience that the pain would return sharply, and specifically when she went back to the tent and stood near the stove. She accepted this. Pain returning was a sign that the feeling was returning, and feeling even uncomfortable, feeling meant that something was still working. She worked through the blue hour before sunrise and into the gray hour of it, and by the time the light was strong enough to see by, without straining, she had worked through a significant portion of the alderman linens, and had begun on the Henderson blankets, which were heavy with water, and required the full commitment of her shoulders and back to wring adequately. She worked them against the washboard and then transferred them to a second basin of cleaner water for rinsing, and then she wrung them out with her hands and carried them to the clothesline she had strung between 2 cottonwood saplings 15 yards back from the bank. The clothesline was new. Or rather, it was the old clothesline repaired, and the repair was not hers. She had noticed it 2 weeks ago, coming back from a delivery in the early evening, the light already thin and the temperature dropping fast. The line had snapped in a wind the week before, the old rope finally giving way at a weakened point, and she had been drying her finished work by draping it over the tent frame and the nearby branches, which was inefficient, and left things smelling of canvas. She had been intending to replace the rope, but had not yet had the time or the coin to spare. And when she came around the stand of willows that evening and saw the new line strung cleanly and correctly between the trees taut and true, she had stopped walking and simply looked at it for a long moment. She had looked for tracks in the mud near the trees, but the ground was uneven and much trafficked from her own daily work, and she could read nothing useful from it. She had looked for any note or indication of who had done it, and found none. She had stood there for a while longer than was perhaps rational, looking at the new rope, and she had felt something she was not entirely prepared for, which was a sudden destabilizing awareness that someone had noticed she needed something and had addressed that need, without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement. It was such a small thing. It was such an enormous thing. She had hung her washing on the new line that evening and said nothing to anyone about it, because there was no one to say anything to. The morning moved forward in the way mornings did when every hour of it was already accounted for. She worked through the blankets and the curtains, transferred the finished pieces to the line, in careful order went back to the tent to feed the stove and drink a cup of the thin bitter coffee that was all she currently had on hand, and then returned to the river for the Reverend's robes, which required a more careful touch. She was kneeling at the bank, her hands moving in the water, when she became aware, through the particular animal alertness of someone who has lived alone in an exposed place long enough to register environmental changes automatically, that something had shifted in the landscape around her. She looked up and to her left toward the far edge of the field that separated her riverside camp from the Carter ranch land. There was a man on horseback at the fence line. He was far enough away that she could not read his face, but she could read the posture, and the posture was not the posture of someone passing through or moving from one place to another. He had stopped. He was looking in her direction. He was sitting very still on a dark horse, and the stillness was not the stillness of casual observation, but of something more considered, more deliberate. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she returned her attention to the Reverend's robes, because she had a great deal of work left to do. And a man on a horse at a fence line was not in the practical arithmetic of her day anything that she could afford to spend time on. But she was aware in the back of her mind as she worked through the rest of the morning that she had seen Elijah Carter at that fence line before. Not always at the same hour, and not always on horseback, sometimes on foot, checking the wire, moving along the field's edge with the unhurried competence of a man who knows his land intimately and tends to it consistently. She had registered his presence the way one registers a landmark, as a stable feature of the landscape that one does not look at directly, but always knows the position of. The Carter Ranch was the largest operation in Red Hollow Valley. Everyone knew this. Everyone knew Elijah Carter by reputation, if not by close acquaintance. Because in a valley this size, the largest landowner and the most successful cattleman was a figure of public significance, whether he sought that significance or not. He was known to be thorough and fair in his dealings, demanding of himself and of his workers, but not unreasonable a man who kept his commitments and expected others to keep theirs. He was in his late 30s, broad through the chest and shoulders, in the way of men who have worked physical land for most of their lives, with a face that was weathered but not aged angular, and quiet, given to economy of expression. He did not socialize in the ways that the town's social hierarchy might have expected of someone of his position. He attended to his business and his land, and appeared largely indifferent to the opinion of Red Hollow's more decorative social circles. Clara had exchanged perhaps 6 sentences with him in the 3 years she had lived on the riverbank that bordered his property, and most of those sentences had been transactional, having to do with whether her washing work was keeping her tent properly weighted against the wind, which on one occasion it had not been, and 2 of his fence posts had been knocked sideways by a section of canvas that had come loose. She had repaired the posts herself before he had the opportunity to say anything about them, and she had said she was sorry for the trouble, and he had said it was not a difficulty, and that had been more or less the extent of their conversation. She did not think about him often. She did not think about any man often in the specific way she had once thought about men before the square and Silas and the basket of preserves and the laughter, because that kind of thinking required a certain fundamental belief in the possibility of something, and that belief had been removed from her carefully and thoroughly, and she had come to regard its absence as a reasonable adjustment rather than a loss. She finished the Reverend's robes by mid-morning, rinsed them twice, and hung them with the kind of painstaking care that their owner's perpetual criticism had trained her to provide. She made a small lunch of dried cornbread and water, standing by the stove watching the flue pipe for any sign of blockage, then bundled the finished alderman pieces which had dried enough to fold and prepared them for delivery. The delivery took her into town, which it always did with a particular kind of internal bracing. The careful assembly of an expression and a posture that would get her through the streets and back without incident. She kept to the less traveled routes when she could. She moved with purpose and without eye contact where it could be avoided. She smiled briefly and professionally at Mrs. Alderman's housekeeper, who received the linens at the side door, accepted the payment in coins, and counted them in her palm as she walked back down the service path. It was on the main street unavoidably that she passed Silas Dowd. He was coming out of the bank with two of his associates, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. And for a fraction of a second, there was the raw, unmediated reaction of mutual recognition before both of their social masks assembled themselves. His mask assembled into something that was worse than contempt, because it was amusement. The easy, proprietary amusement of a man who has done damage to someone, and knows it and finds the ongoing evidence of that damage entertaining. "Clara May," he said in the tone of a man greeting an old joke. "Mr. Dowd," she said in the tone of a woman greeting a stranger. She kept walking. She heard him say something to his associates. In a lowered voice, heard the response of smothered laughter, and she kept walking with her spine straight and her chin level and her face arranged in the careful blankness that was her greatest social achievement. The face that said with absolute authority that she felt nothing, that she was impervious, that what had happened in the square 3 years ago had left no mark worth acknowledging. She had perfected this face over a long time. She was very good at it. It was only when she was back on the river path, out of sight of the street, that she allowed herself to stop for a moment and press the back of her cold hand against her mouth and breathe very carefully in and out until the shaking in her chest settled. Then she straightened herself and walked back to the tent to start the afternoon's work. The Henderson blankets were ready to fold and return. The curtains needed another hour on the line. There was a new bundle waiting, dropped at the edge of the camp by whoever had left it, the Henderson boy, probably a week's worth of the family's everyday washing that would need sorting and treating before she could begin on it properly. She sorted it now, standing at the tent entrance with the weak afternoon sun on her back, separating whites from colors, checking for stains that would need pre-treatment with the borax paste she made herself, because it was cheaper than buying it prepared. It was ordinary work. It was the specific, granular, unspectacular work of a life conducted in the practical rather than the aspirational, and she was good at it. And being good at it was the thing she had built her sense of herself upon, in the absence of the other things, the warmth and the belonging and the being chosen that she had given up trying to want. She worked until the light failed. She ate the last of her cornbread with a cup of water and sat for a while in the entrance of the tent, watching the river in the dusk, listening to the particular silence of a cold evening in a valley where the mountains close in early, and the darkness comes down from the peaks before it comes from the sky. The firewood was stacked beside the tent. She had noticed 2 weeks ago, the same week as the clothesline that someone had added to her woodpile. She had come back from a delivery to find a substantial quantity of split dry pine stacked neatly against the tent's exterior, far more than she had put there herself, and of a quality of split and drying that suggested someone who was very competent with an axe and had access to well-seasoned timber. She had looked at it for a long time. She had looked toward the Carter fence line. She had not gone to thank him, because she was not certain enough, and because approaching a man she was not certain of with gratitude for something she could not be sure he had done seemed like an exposure she was not prepared to risk. But she had burned the wood through the worst nights of the past 2 weeks, and she had been warm or something close to warm in a way that she had not managed the previous winter, and something about that specific warmth, the warmth of wood that someone had cut and carried for her without being asked, and without requiring acknowledgement, made her throat tighten in a way that the cold and the hard work and Silas Dowd's smirk never had. She would not let it become anything. It was too dangerous to let it become anything. She was too old at 32 and too thoroughly schooled in the precise cost of hoping to let a stack of firewood and a length of new rope rearrange her understanding of what her life was or was not going to be. She put more wood in the stove, pulled her blankets around her, and went to sleep with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to take rest when it is available. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily, and at the very edge of the northern sky where the mountains met the dark, the first formless clouds of what would become the season's first real storm were beginning to build. She woke before the alarm she did not own, which was to say, she woke when the cold became impossible, rather than merely uncomfortable, which was how she had been waking for the better part of 3 winters. The stove had gone down to coals in the deep hours before dawn, and the temperature inside the tent had dropped to the point where her breath was visible, and the edge of her water bucket wore a thin film of ice across its surface. She rose without ceremony, added wood to the coals with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that the sequence requires no conscious thought. Pulled her heaviest coat over the 2 layers she had slept in and stepped outside to assess the morning. What she found when she stepped out was a sky that troubled her. It was not the usual pre-dawn darkness of a cold, clear night, which had its own quality. A deep, clean blackness with a hard floor of stars and the kind of silence that was the absence of weather rather than the presence of calm. This was something different. The stars were gone, not obscured gradually by the kind of high, thin cloud cover that came and went without consequence, but gone entirely buried under a ceiling so solid and so low that the darkness had taken on a different texture, something dense and pressurized, the darkness of a sky that is holding something back and not planning to hold it much longer. The wind had shifted. It was coming now from the northwest, which in Red Hollow Valley meant it was coming down off the high passes through the mountain range that formed the valley's northern wall, and wind from that direction at this time of year carried with it the specific vocabulary of the high country in winter. She stood in the entrance of her tent for a moment, reading it with the instinctive fluency of someone who has spent years living close enough to the weather to understand its grammar. What she read did not encourage her. She had deliveries to make, and more pressingly, she had 2 large sets of linens belonging to the Alderman household and the Morrison family that were currently spread across her 2 clotheslines, having been hung the evening before. They were clean and they were dry, and they represented work she had already done and payment she was counting on. And if a serious storm came in while they were still on the line, the damage to the linens would be irreversible, and the loss of the payment would be something she could not easily absorb. She made the practical calculation quickly, the way she always did, reducing the situation to its component variables and responding to the most urgent first. The linens had to come down and be stored safely before anything else, and then she needed to assess how much wood she had for the stove. And then she needed to determine whether any of her deliveries were urgent enough to attempt before the weather turned, or whether they could safely wait. She had been making calculations of this kind continuously, and without much assistance for long enough that the process was nearly invisible to her, absorbed into the background processing of a mind that had learned to run multiple urgent calculations simultaneously just to stay even. There was no one to share the calculation with. There was no one to say, "Do you think this storm is serious, or what should we do about the linens?" There was just Clara in her coat, reading a bad sky and the work that needed doing, regardless of whether it was doing she wanted. She set to it. By the time the first gray light of morning began to gather, she had taken both sets of linens from the lines, folded them with the practiced speed of someone who folds things many times a day, wrapped them in the oilcloth covers she kept for weather protection, and stowed them inside the tent where the stove's heat would keep them from any residual dampness. She had checked her wood supply, which was better than it would have been without the addition of those split pine sections 2 weeks ago, better enough that she allowed herself a moment of something she chose not to name before she moved on to the next problem. She had a partial load of mending 3 shirts and a dress belonging to the Morrison girl that she could complete inside the tent while the weather built. She worked at the mending through the morning, seated close to the stove on her 1 wooden stool, her needle moving steadily through fabric, while outside the wind increased in a slow, purposeful way that told her the storm was not changing its mind. By noon, the first snow was falling. It began as the kind of snow that can be mistaken for sleet, fine and hard and angled sharply by the wind, the kind that stings any exposed skin and finds its way into the gap between a collar and a neck, and accumulates less as a blanket than as an infiltration. Clara completed the Morrison mending, packed it for delivery, and sat for a moment with her hands around a cup of hot water and considered her options. The Morrison house was on the near side of town, perhaps 20 minutes on foot in good conditions. She could make it and return before the storm worsened if she went now. The payment was $3, which was not nothing. The alternative was to wait, which meant Mrs. Morrison would have to wait for her daughter's dress, which Mrs. Morrison had mentioned twice as being needed for a social occasion that Clara had gathered was this week. She was conscientious about her commitments in the specific way of someone who understands that her reputation for reliability is one of the few things she has actual control over. She put on her coat, her scarf, her heaviest work gloves, and she went. The town was quieter than usual under the thickening snow. She made the delivery, quickly accepted the payment, exchanged the minimum necessary words with Mrs. Morrison's housekeeper, and turned back toward the river. By the time she was on the return path, the snow had intensified, not catastrophically, not yet, but with the steady, escalating commitment of a storm that was settling in for serious work. The flakes were larger now, proper winter flakes accumulating on the ground with the quiet industriousness that meant real accumulation was coming. She was halfway back when she noticed that the light had changed. Not changed in the ordinary way of afternoon moving toward evening, but changed in the specific way that happens before a serious mountain storm drops its full weight, a kind of dimming and flattening of the available light that turns the familiar landscape into something unrecognizable. All its usual reference points softened and then erased by the building white. She knew this light. She had read about whiteout conditions in the almanac she had borrowed from the Reverend's library, and returned without ever telling him she had borrowed it, because she had understood from a young age that knowledge was available to her mainly through unofficial channels, and she had become adept at using those channels without advertisement. She knew the theory. She had not yet experienced the full reality. She was on the river path which she knew by feel and by footfall, every stone and hollow of it memorized through daily use, and she was moving at a pace that was faster than her usual deliberate stride, because the cold was significant and the path was quickly becoming difficult underfoot. She could hear the river to her left, which was a reassurance, a fixed audio landmark when the visual ones were disappearing. She was fine. She was 20 minutes from the tent. She was not afraid. Then the wind changed. It came down off the ridge in a way that was entirely different from the cold, steady pressure of the previous hours. A sudden violent shift that brought with it a wall of snow that was less like precipitation and more like a physical substance, dense and blinding and all-directional, coming from everywhere at once in the way that mountain blizzard snow sometimes does when the wind catches it from the ground as well as from the sky. In the space of perhaps a minute, visibility dropped from 30 yards to 3. The river's sound was still there, but the wind was loud enough now to interfere with her ability to locate it precisely. The path under her feet, which she had been reading by the specific resistance of known ground, was now covered in 3 inches of fresh snow, with more arriving every second, and the familiar texture was gone. She stopped walking because she understood with the clear, practical intelligence that was her most reliable tool that moving in the wrong direction in these conditions was considerably more dangerous than standing still. She turned herself carefully, attempting to reorient by what she knew of the terrain, and found that the turning had done something disorienting to her sense of direction that she had not anticipated. The sound of the river was in her left ear, or she thought it was, but the wind was also in her left ear, and the two were harder to distinguish than she had expected. She took 3 steps in what she believed was the direction of the tent and found that the ground dropped unexpectedly, not sharply enough to be dangerous, but enough to tell her that she was not on the path she thought she was on. She stopped again. The cold, which had been something she was managing, was now something that was beginning to manage her. She had been out in it for the better part of 40 minutes since she left the Morrison house, and the physical work of moving through thickening snow against a strong wind was the kind of work that spent heat, fast even from a body as well built for endurance as hers. She could feel the cold moving past the outer layer of her defenses with the patient insistence of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. Her hands inside the heavy gloves were beginning to go from cold to something deeper than cold. Her face, where the scarf did not cover it, felt both numb and intensely raw at once. She was not panicking. She was taking inventory, which was a different thing. She knew she was somewhere near the river path. She knew the Carter fence line was to the east of the path, roughly parallel to it, for a stretch of about 400 yards. She knew that the ground sloped slightly toward the river and slightly away from the Carter land, which meant that if she moved uphill even marginally, she was moving toward the fence line and toward the pasture, which was more dangerous territory in a blizzard because of the openness, but which had one significant feature: the Carter barn. She had seen the Carter barn every day for 3 years. It was a massive structure, red-painted, set back from the fence line by perhaps 200 yards, large enough to be visible even in moderate snow. She did not know whether it would be visible now. She did not know whether 200 yards of open pasture in a full mountain blizzard was navigable. She knew that staying where she was on a slight slope above a half-frozen river in sub-zero wind was not a sustainable option. She began to move uphill. The progress was slow, and it cost her. The snow was above her ankles now, and the wind was directly in her face for the first stretch, and she kept her head down and moved forward with the particular determination that was at its core, the same determination she brought to a pile of frozen laundry at 5 in the morning, the determination of someone who has decided that stopping is not among the available options. Her legs were burning with cold and with effort. The oilcloth cover she was still carrying, the now empty wrapping from the Morrison delivery, flapped violently against her body. She thought briefly about dropping it and decided against it, because decisions made in crisis conditions on the basis of immediate discomfort were often decisions you regretted, and she had not survived 3 winters on the riverbank by making decisions on the basis of immediate discomfort. She found the fence line by walking into it. Not hard, just the specific, definitive contact of wire against the front of her coat, and she reached out and caught the top wire with both hands and held it, closing her eyes for a moment, in something that was not quite relief, because she was not yet safe, but was the acknowledgement of one fixed point located in an otherwise undifferentiated field of white. She turned along the fence line, using it as a guide rail, moving in the direction she calculated the barn to be, and she counted her steps, which was a method of maintaining spatial reasoning that she had read about and now understood in her bones rather than merely in her mind. 50 steps, 60, 70. The wind was slightly less murderous, moving along the fence line with it at a partial angle, rather than full in the face. She could feel herself becoming slower, which she recognized as the beginning of a process she needed to interrupt before it went further. The body conserving heat by reducing function was a reasonable short-term adaptation. The problem was the timeline. She was counting 93 when she heard something that was not the wind. It was a voice, a single word spoken with the concentrated volume of someone trying to project against significant atmospheric resistance. Here. Not her name, not a question, just the flat, imperative syllable of someone communicating a direction rather than initiating a conversation. She turned toward it. He emerged from the white about 10 yards away, moving toward the fence with the specific, effortful gait of someone working through serious drifts, his hat pulled low and his coat collar up, and his face, when she could see it through the blowing snow, was arranged in the expression of a man who is doing something with his entire attention and has no surplus capacity available for anything other than the immediate problem. He reached her and did not say anything immediately, which she later thought was the right instinct, because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already communicated. He looked at her for a moment, assessing the way a person looks at something they need to understand before they can act on it. Then he put his arm out, not gracefully, not with the gesture of a man sweeping someone off their feet, but with the practical, solid movement of a man offering a structural support, and she understood what he was doing, and she took his arm, and he pulled her arm across his shoulders, and they stood for a moment like that, finding the weight distribution establishing the shared balance. "Barn is 200 yards, he said directly into her ear, because the wind required that proximity to make speech intelligible. "We go together." "All right," she said, and they went. It was not easy, and it was not graceful, and it was not the kind of rescue that the word rescue might call to mind if a person were accustomed to thinking of rescue as something that happened quickly and cleanly, one person saving another through superior capability. It was a mutual and effortful thing. He was stronger than she was, in certain respects, heavier, with the mechanical advantage of his size, and the additional winter clothing he had had the foresight to put on before coming out into this. But the drifts were deep enough that strength was only part of what the traverse required. She was not a person who could be easily moved in the physical sense, and in the conditions they were navigating, the solidity and mass of her build were not liabilities. They moved through the snow as a single, ungainly, determined unit, leaning into each other and into the wind, and when he stumbled in a drift, she braced against him, and when she slipped on a buried irregularity in the ground, his arm tightened around her, and in this way, incrementally and without ceremony, they covered the 200 yards. The barn door required both of them to open it against the wind. He worked the latch with one hand while she put her shoulder against the door, and together they forced it back far enough to get inside. And then he pulled it shut behind them, and the roar of the storm became suddenly muffled, replaced by the enormous warm living silence of a large barn in winter, full of animal breath and hay smell, and the specific grounded quality of a space that has been standing solidly through many storms. Clara stood just inside the door and breathed. The warmth was so immediate and so physical after the cold outside that it felt almost like pressure, like the air had weight. She could hear horses moving in their stalls, the soft, incurious shifting of animals who were secure in their shelter and were merely noting the arrival of newcomers. Somewhere deeper in the barn, a lantern burned, throwing warm orange light across the straw-covered floor and the rough timber of the stalls. She realized she was shaking. She had been shaking for some time, but inside the barn where it was safe to notice things like that, it became more apparent. Elijah Carter was standing a few feet away, pulling his coat off, and he turned to look at her with the same direct, unsentimental attention he had brought to the whole of the last 20 minutes, and he said, with the flat economy of someone who considers obvious things worth stating plainly, "You need to be warmer." "I will be," she said. And even as she said it, her teeth were doing something she could not entirely prevent. He gestured toward the back of the barn where the lantern burned, where there was a small enclosed tack room off the main floor. "Warmer than standing by the door," he said, and it was not unkind, it was simply accurate, and she followed him because accuracy was something she understood and respected. The tack room was small and dry, and held on a nail by the door a horse blanket that was clean enough and thick enough to be useful. He took it down without ceremony and held it out to her, and she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, and the weight of it and the residual warmth of the enclosed room and the simple fact of being out of the wind combined into something that made her close her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, he had turned away and was adding fuel to a small iron stove in the corner of the tack room, a stove similar in size to her own and clearly well used, the kind of thing a man installs in a space where he spends working hours in winter. He was not looking at her. He was doing the thing that needed doing, which she recognized as his operating style, and found against her better judgment deeply comprehensible. She sat down on the low wooden bench against the wall, which she did not realize she was going to do until she had done it, and she wrapped the horse blanket tighter around herself and watched him build the fire. And outside the barn, the storm pressed against the walls with a sound like something that intended to continue for a long time. He had found her in that. He had come out into that deliberately, she understood now, to look for her because he had seen from somewhere that she was not where she should be, and he had come out. She sat with this information and did not know what to do with it, which was an unusual condition for a woman who generally knew exactly what to do with information. "You came out looking," she said. It was not a question. He understood it was not a question. "Saw you on the path this morning," he said, not turning from the stove. "Saw you hadn't come back." He said it the way he might say that he had noticed a fence wire down or a water trough that needed attention, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who noticed what was in his field of vision and responded to what required response. Clara looked at the horse blanket across her knees and said nothing for a moment. "You could have been killed," she said, and she meant it as an acknowledgement of what he had done rather than a rebuke, but she was aware that it came out in a tone somewhere between the two. "Cold," he said, which seemed to be his entire assessment of the risk he had taken, and in its brevity it was so perfectly representative of a certain kind of man, the kind she had very little experience with, and was deeply unprepared for that. She did not say anything else for a while. The stove began to put out real heat. Outside, the blizzard settled into itself with the long, committed fury of a storm that has decided to stay. The stove in the tack room did its work slowly, and then all at once the way heat works in a small, well-insulated space. Building in increments that are barely perceptible, and then arriving as a totality that is almost startling. Clara felt it first in her feet, which moved back through the stages of numbness in the specific unpleasant sequence she recognized from other bad winters, the deep ache of returning circulation that was painful in the way of something healing rather than something worsening. She accepted the pain with the practical patience she brought to most uncomfortable things, and kept her hands wrapped around the tin cup of water that Elijah had heated on the stove surface without being asked to, and sat on the bench beside her without comment. He was not a man who required acknowledgement for small acts. She had already understood this about him. In the partial inferential way, she had understood most things about him, but being in the same enclosed space with him made it more specific, more observable. He moved through the tack room with the unhurried competence of someone in a space they know thoroughly, checking things, adjusting things, performing the small maintenance tasks that accumulate in any working barn through the hours of a day, and the performance of these tasks in her presence was neither pointed nor self-conscious. He was not ignoring her. He was simply not performing for her, which was different, and which she found, after some consideration, more comfortable than performance would have been. The horses in the main barn floor had settled back into their usual quiet. The storm outside had reached what sounded like its full register, a sustained battering force that made the barn's solid timbers speak occasionally in low, strained tones that were not alarming exactly, but were a reminder of what was happening on the other side of the walls. Clara listened to those tones and to the wind, and to the small domestic sounds of the stove doing its work, and she sat with the unusual, slightly disorienting experience of being warm when she had not expected to be warm, and being still when her body had been in continuous motion since before dawn. The stillness was the problem. She recognized it when it started the particular restlessness that came over her whenever she stopped moving long enough for her mind to turn from the practical to the personal. It was the same restlessness that drove her out of her sleeping pallet before the cold forced her, that kept her working until her hands would not close properly around her needle that had filled every quiet hour of the past 3 years with some form of labor. Stillness was where the things she did not allow herself to think about during working hours found the gaps in her defenses and moved through them. She stood up from the bench before she had consciously decided to stand up. Elijah looked up from the bridle he had been working at a piece of tack with a cracked leather strap that he had taken from its hook on the wall and was examining with the focused attention he appeared to bring to everything within his purview. Clara looked around the tack room with the systematic assessment of someone taking inventory. The saddle blankets on their rack, the rows of bridles and halters, a pile of canvas grain sacks in the corner, 2 of which had split seams. Her eyes settled on the grain sacks. "Those need mending," she said, and she said it without thinking, or rather she said it because she had been trained through long practice to respond to the presence of work that needed doing as a reflex rather than a choice. She was already moving toward the grain sacks when she said it. "Leave them," he said. It was not sharp, and it was not unkind. It was the same flat, direct tone he had used for everything, the tone of a man who says what he means with the minimum necessary words. But it stopped her in a way that a sharper tone might not have, because she had built her defenses against sharpness and had fewer defenses against simple directness. She turned to look at him. He had set the bridle down and was looking at her with the same quality of attention she had noticed before, the attention that did not flinch and did not assess in the sideways evaluating way of people who are deciding how to use what they see. It was a direct attention. It was the kind of attention that expected to be met directly, and she found it both difficult and, somewhere beneath the difficulty, something she did not have a clean word for. "I cannot just sit," she said. "Why not?" The question was genuine. He was not being rhetorical. He was asking because he wanted to know the answer, and the genuineness of it was what made it land as hard as it did, because she had not been asked that question before, or not in that tone, and she did not have a prepared answer for it. She looked at the grain sacks. She looked at her hands. "It is not a useful habit," she said finally, which was not an answer to his question, and she knew it, and she thought he probably knew it too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from where he had been crouching, and he crossed the small space of the tack room, and he held out his hand, not in the gesture of someone offering assistance to a person who needs to be helped up or helped along, but with the palm turned upward, an invitation rather than a direction. "Let me see," he said. She did not know for a moment what he meant. Then she understood that he meant her hands, and the understanding produced an instinctive physical withdrawal, not dramatic, just the small, almost imperceptible closing of her posture that was the body's way of protecting the things it knew to be vulnerable. Her hands were not something she showed people. They were the evidence of what her life required of her, and the evidence was not delicate. He waited. He did not push. He simply stood there with his palm open and his patience apparent, and the combination of those things, the open hand and the patience, dismantled the withdrawal more effectively than any argument could have. She put her hands into his. He looked at them the way he looked at the bridle, with the focused, unsentimental attention of someone assessing a thing they intend to take seriously. Her hands were large for a woman, broad-palmed and capable, the knuckles swollen with cold and with the repetitive stress of her work. The skin along the fingers cracked in several places and reddened across the backs, where the cold water had gotten deepest. The calluses were thick and precisely located the topography of a specific kind of labor worn into the flesh over years. He went to the shelf above the stove and took down a tin, a round, flat tin of the kind used for salves and balms, and he came back and opened it, and she could smell the lanolin and something herbal she did not immediately identify. Sheep salve, the kind used for treating cracked hooves and chapped skin in the deep of winter on working livestock, clean and useful and not refined. He took a small amount on his fingers, and he began to work it into her hands, beginning with the cracked knuckles, and the gesture was so matter-of-fact, and so devoid of condescension or pity, or the particular quality of benevolence that makes a person feel reduced by being helped, that she stood very still and allowed it. It hurt initially in the places where the skin had cracked, and then the hurt gave way to something that was the physical opposite of the numbness she had been managing all morning. A warmth that moved from the surface inward, slow and thorough. "These," he said, and he was looking at her hands as he worked the salve into them, "are not something to be hidden." She looked at him. "These hands kept you alive," he said, "when the world turned its back on you. I respect them." She did not say anything. There was a significant pressure behind her eyes that she managed by looking at a fixed point on the tack room wall, which was a knot in the wood plank, and concentrating on it with an intensity that had nothing to do with the knot. She had been told many things about her hands over the years. She had been told they were too rough, too large, too much the hands of a working woman, and not enough the hands of a lady. She had been told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that they were evidence of a life that was deficient in the ways that mattered to the people doing the telling. She had never been told that they were something to be respected. She had not known until this moment how specifically she had been waiting to hear that. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of another person in 3 years, and she was not going to start now, and the discipline of not crying was by this point so ingrained that it held, though it held at some cost. "Thank you," she said, which was inadequate and was all she had. He nodded once the way he acknowledged things that had been said and received without requiring anything more elaborate, and he set the tin of salve on the bench beside her in a way that indicated she should keep using it, and he went back to the bridle. She sat back down on the bench. She held her salved hands in her lap and looked at them, and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was something she almost never did, and which the circumstances seemed unusually to permit. The storm ran its full violence against the barn through the afternoon. She could track its intensity by the sounds it made against the structure, the way the wind would build to a peak and then momentarily ease, not retreating but gathering before building again with renewed purpose. The horses in the main barn were calm, which she took as the assessment of animals with better instruments for reading atmospheric conditions than hers, and found reassuring. Elijah worked at things in the quiet, methodical way that was apparently simply how he moved through the world. And Clara watched him when she thought she could do so without being obvious about it, which was to say she watched him the way she had learned to watch everything she did not want to be caught watching from the periphery and in pieces. He moved to the main barn floor at intervals to check the horses and the water troughs and the ventilation, and he came back, and each time he came back, he added something to the stove without remarking on it. At some point in the late afternoon, he made food. It was not elaborate, a pan set on the stove surface, with dried beef, and a handful of root vegetables from a sack on a high shelf. The kind of simple, practical fuel that a man who works outdoors in winter keeps on hand against the likelihood of not being able to get back to a house. He set a portion on the bench beside her. She looked at it, and then at him. "Eat oil," he said. "I have put you to enough trouble," she said. "Eating is not trouble," he said. "Arguing about it is." She ate. It was plain and hot, and it was in its plainness and its heat exactly what her body needed, and the recognition of being given exactly what she needed, without ceremony or expectation of gratitude, produced again that complex tightening in her chest that she addressed by eating steadily and keeping her eyes on the pan. The light through the barn's high ventilation gaps had moved from the gray of afternoon to the deeper gray of early evening when she noticed the doors. She noticed them because Elijah had stood up from what he was doing and crossed to the main barn's large double doors which faced the open pasture and bore the full pressure of the wind from that direction. and she could see from where she sat through the open tack room doorway that the doors were moving in their frame. Not dangerously, not yet, but with the beginning of an insistence that spoke to how the wind had shifted and strengthened in the last hour. She watched him assess the doors, then reach for the thick rope lashed to the interior beam that served as the locking mechanism for weather conditions, and she watched his hands move through the sequence of securing it, and she watched the knot he tied take shape on the latch as he worked it, and her brain did the thing that had helped her survive this long, which was to receive information and connect it to other information with the automatic speed of a person who has learned that details matter. The knot was a figure 8, the kind that distributes load across 2 lines simultaneously. That is stable under variable pressure, that is not decorative or conventional, but is specifically functionally correct for the purpose of securing something against the kind of unpredictable shifting force that a mountain blizzard applies to a door. She had seen this knot once before, tied with the same efficiency, the same economy of motion. She had seen it on her clothesline on the new section of rope at the point where the rope connected to the far cottonwood sapling. The realization moved through her slowly, and then all at once the way the warmth of the stove had moved through her, incremental, and then total. She sat very still. He had repaired her clothesline. He had come to the river in the dark at some hour when she was either asleep or away, and he had spliced the broken line and tied it correctly for the load and the conditions with the same knot he was using right now on his own barn door, and then he had walked away without leaving any sign except the repair itself, and the wood, she thought. The carefully split, well-seasoned pine, stacked with its grain, properly oriented, so that it would remain dry even in bad weather, stacked by someone who knew how to stack wood for long-term storage rather than immediate use. She looked at the figure 8 knot which he had tied and secured, and was now testing with a solid, considered pull to check its hold, and she felt something shift in the architecture of what she had believed about her life in Red Hollow Valley over the past 3 years. She had believed she was alone. She had made her peace with being alone or something that functioned adequately as peace. She had built her routines and her defenses and her careful blankness around the central fact of her aloneness, and the fact had been true. She was not wrong. That it had been true. But she understood now that at some point in the last several weeks, without her knowledge and without her permission, it had become slightly less true than it had been, and the person responsible for that shift was standing 15 feet away, testing the hold of a knot he had first tied in the dark beside her clothesline. Elijah came back to the tack room entrance and stopped when he saw her face. She did not know what her face was doing. She had lost track of it, which was rare. "The doors are holding," he said, which was a practical statement, but was also, she thought, a question of a different kind. "The knot will hold," she said carefully. "It is the right knot for that kind of pressure." He looked at her. She saw something move behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a person who has been understood in a specific way that they had not anticipated being understood. He said nothing. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than the usual exchange. The length of time that two people hold each other's attention when they have both recognized that something has been said that cannot be unsaid, that a door has been opened that cannot be convincingly reclosed. Then he looked away, and he went to the stove and checked the fuel, and the ordinary life of the barn continued around them, and the storm continued outside, and Clara sat with her salved hands in her lap, and the knowledge of the figure 8 knot settled in her chest like something warm and solid and almost unbearably terrifying. She did not speak about it. He did not speak about it. The speaking of it was not yet the right thing, and she thought they both understood this, which was itself a form of understanding that she had not expected to find in the tack room of a man she had exchanged perhaps 6 sentences with in 3 years. The storm continued through the night. She slept on the bench in the tack room, wrapped in the horse blanket, and she slept better than she had slept in a long time, which she attributed to the combined exhaustion of physical cold and effort rather than to anything she was not prepared to attribute it to, because she was still even now cautious about what she allowed herself to conclude. Elijah slept in the main barn on a cot he pulled from a storage hook, positioned where he could hear the horses. This was not, she understood, a courtesy arrangement made on her behalf. It was simply where he slept when he kept barn watch in serious weather. He had probably slept there many times. The knowledge that his presence was not a performance but a function was in the specific accounting of her trust worth considerably more than a performance would have been. She woke once in the deep hours to find the stove needed attention, and tended it herself, and she heard him do the same in the main barn, and the parallel waking the two of them, each tending their own small fires in the same large storm, seemed in the darkness like something that could be a metaphor for something, and she allowed herself to notice this, and then set it aside, and went back to sleep. By morning the storm had broken. It had not retreated quietly, because storms of that kind do not retreat quietly. It had reduced itself over the last hours of darkness in the way of something that has spent its full force and has nothing left with which to continue the wind dropping from its sustained roar to a last intermittent gusting, the snow tapering from dense curtains to scattered flurries to the occasional wandering flake. By the time the light came back, it came back clear. The particular hard crystalline clarity of a post-blizzard morning, in the mountains, a sky so blue it almost hurt, a landscape so white and so still that it looked like something that had been made rather than something that had happened. Clara stood in the barn doorway and looked at it. Everything was changed. The riverbank would be under 2 feet of snow. Her tent would be buried to the eaves. The path she walked every day would be entirely invisible. The world she had organized and made navigable through 3 years of careful routine was this morning reorganized by forces she had not controlled and could not have controlled, and the effect of this was not, as she might have expected, primarily distressing. There was something underneath the practical concerns, underneath the already beginning calculation of what needed to be done and in what order, that was quieter than distress. Something that was trying to tell her that not all reorganizations were losses. She heard him behind her in the barn, the sounds of morning chores beginning, the horses being attended to. She turned back from the doorway, and she straightened her coat, and she took a breath of the cold, clean morning air that came in off the white fields, and she told herself she had work to do and a tent to dig out, and deliveries to reschedule, and all of that was true. It was all true. And so she was beginning to suspect was something else entirely. She walked back to the riverbank in the sharp crystalline morning that followed the storm, and Elijah walked with her as far as the fence line without being asked, and without making anything of it, which was she was learning his way. The snow was deep enough that the path required breaking rather than following, and he went first through the worst of the drifts without discussing the arrangement, because the arrangement was obvious, and he was not the kind of man who required discussion of obvious things. At the fence line he stopped, and she stopped with him, and they stood for a moment in the blue and white silence of the post-storm morning. "The tent will need digging out," he said. "I know," she said. "I will send one of my men down with a shovel this afternoon." She looked at him. The refusal was on her tongue before she had thought about it, shaped and ready, the same refusal she applied to any offer of assistance that came with the implied weight of obligation or pity. She felt it assembled in her mouth, and then she looked at his face, which held no pity and no implication, only the same practical directness with which he addressed fence lines and barn doors and women lost in blizzards, and the refusal lost its form. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned back toward the ranch. She watched him go for a moment, the broad, unhurried figure moving back through the snow toward the red-painted barn, and then she turned toward the river and went to see what the storm had left her. What it had left her was substantial work. The tent was buried to the point where she could not have located the entrance without knowing precisely where to look, and the clotheslines were collapsed under the accumulated weight of snow, and the wood she had stacked against the exterior had been partially displaced by a drift that had formed along the tent's windward side. She dug out the entrance herself with the flat-bladed tool she kept for weather emergencies, working steadily through the cold morning until she could get inside and assess the interior. The stove had gone entirely cold, which she had expected, and the interior temperature was brutal, but the tent itself was structurally sound, and the stored linens wrapped in their oilcloth were undamaged. She rebuilt the stove fire and stood close to it for a while, making a list in her mind of what needed immediate attention and what could wait. The afternoon man came as promised, a young ranch hand named Thomas, who was respectful and efficient, and who dug out the wood stack and reset the clothesline posts without any indication that he found the assignment remarkable in any way, which she appreciated because it suggested the assignment had been given in the same spirit. She gave him a cup of hot water and thanked him, and he touched his hat and went back up the hill, and she watched him go with the particular careful feeling of someone who is not yet accustomed to help arriving without a cost attached. That was Thursday. By Sunday, Red Hollow Valley had done what small valley communities do with information that does not belong to them, which is to say it had processed it, discussed it, elaborated it, and returned it to circulation in a form that bore the relationship to the original event. That a rumor always bears to a fact, which is to say the relationship of a distorted reflection to the thing it reflects. Clara first understood the dimensions of what was circulating when she went into town Monday morning to make her weekly delivery to the dry goods store and Mrs. Hendricks, who ran the store with her husband and who had always been neutral toward Clara in the particular way of people who are not unkind but who take their social cues from those around them, looked at her with an expression that was the specific combination of sympathy and fascination that a person wears when they have been told something they are not sure how to handle and are very interested in how the subject of that something is going to behave. "Clara May," she said in a tone that had been adjusted for the occasion. "Mrs. Hendricks," Clara said, and set the bundle of folded table linens on the counter and took out her receipt book. "I imagine it has been a difficult few days," Mrs. Hendricks said, which Clara understood was an invitation to provide information, and she did not accept the invitation. "The storm was hard on the camp," she said, which was true, and was confined to weather, and she wrote out the receipt and accepted her payment and left. But she had seen the look, and she saw variations of the look on the walk back to the river path from the two women who passed her on the main street with the slightly too deliberate casualness of people who have been discussing you, and from the man outside the hardware store who was not someone she knew well, but who watched her pass with the kind of speculative attention that meant she had entered his social calculations in a new way. She told herself, walking home through the cold, that she was reading too much into ordinary social behavior, that people looked at one another in small towns for all kinds of reasons, and that she had been the subject of attention before and survived it. She almost believed herself. The content of what was being said reached her with more specificity 2 days later in a way she had not anticipated. She was at the Reverend's house delivering his mended robes when she was admitted by his housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Garland, who had always treated Clara with a blunt, unsentimental decency that was among the more reliable forms of human contact in her weekly rounds. Mrs. Garland brought her into the kitchen to wait for the Reverend and set a cup of actual coffee in front of her without ceremony. And then she sat down across from her with the expression of someone who has decided that a person deserves to know something, even if the knowing is uncomfortable. "I am going to tell you what they are saying," Mrs. Garland said, "because you are better equipped to deal with something you can see than something you cannot." Clara set her hands around the coffee cup. "Go ahead," she said. Mrs. Garland told her. The version circulating through the valley's social networks, she explained, had been shaped and sharpened by someone with a specific interest in the shaping, and Mrs. Garland did not say Silas Dowd's name, but she did not need to because the particular quality of the cruelty had his signature on it, the casual proprietary cruelty of a man who has decided that the person he damaged still owes him the decency of staying damaged. The story that had spread in the version Mrs. Garland had heard it through two separate sources was that Clara May Whitlock, knowing the storm was coming, had manufactured a reason to be out on the trail near Carter Ranch property. During the worst of it, had allowed herself to be found by Elijah Carter and had spent the night in his barn with calculated intent to compromise his reputation and attach herself to his standing in the community. The words Mrs. Garland used were restrained, but the architecture of the story was clear, and its intent was clear, and its origin was clear. Clara sat with the coffee cup and listened to all of it without changing her expression. And when Mrs. Garland finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me." "It is vicious," Mrs. Garland said, with the flat, factual delivery of a woman who has lived long enough to call things what they are. "Yes," Clara said, "and it is Silas Dowd behind it." "Almost certainly," Clara said. "What will you do?" Clara looked at the coffee cup. She looked at her hands around it, which were steady because her hands were almost always steady. It was one of the things she could rely on, even when nothing else was reliable. She thought about what she would do, and she understood with a clear, steady intelligence that the warmth of the Carter barn had not diminished, that the question of what she would do and the question of what she was afraid of were not the same question, and that confusing them would be a mistake. "My work," she said. "I will do my work." Mrs. Garland looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who recognizes quality when they encounter it. Then she refilled the coffee cup and said nothing more about it. But the work over the following days became more complicated. One client, a woman whose household washing Clara had managed without complaint or incident for 18 months, sent a note via her housemaid saying that she would be making other arrangements. The note offered no explanation, and the housemaid would not meet Clara's eyes when she delivered it, which told Clara what the explanation was, without the note needing to provide it. A second client, a man whose family linens Clara had always collected from and delivered to the rear service entrance, arranged for his wife to intercept her at the front gate on delivery day and pay her off for the completed work with the additional information delivered with visible discomfort that they would not be requiring her services further. 2 clients in 4 days. She could not absorb the loss easily. She would manage it because she had managed worse, but it required adjustment, and adjustment required a particular kind of emotional energy that she was already spending on other things. She had not seen Elijah Carter since he had walked her to the fence line the morning after the storm. She was aware in the background of her daily calculations of the absence in a way she was working at not examining too closely. She was also aware that his name was in the center of the story being told about her, which meant that the story was his problem as much as hers, and the thought of being someone else's problem in a way that could cost them something real was not a thought she could be comfortable with. The social pressure on Elijah Carter arrived, she learned later, in the form of 2 separate conversations on the same afternoon that she lost her second client. The first was with Harlan Phelps, who held the note on the Carter Ranch's operating loan and who had an interest in the social reputation of any enterprise whose debt he carried. Phelps was not a man who delivered unpleasantness directly, but he was skilled at delivering it indirectly through the specific language of financial concern, and he visited Elijah at the ranch on the afternoon in question to discuss the loan and to allow the conversation to move, as he intended it to, toward the subject of the ranch's standing in the community and the kinds of associations that either supported or complicated that standing. The second was from a delegation of 3 men who represented the Valley's Cattlemen's Association, of which Elijah was a prominent member, and who arrived separately but on the same afternoon, which was almost certainly not a coincidence. Their message was similar in substance to Phelps', though more directly stated, which was that Elijah's continued association with the woman on the riverbank in any form that could be observed or discussed was creating a difficulty for the association's social relationships with the valley's more established families. Clara did not know the specifics of either conversation at the time they occurred. What she knew was their effect, or what she believed their effect to be, because the effect arrived for her in the form of silence. The wood supply beside her tent was not added to during the week that followed the storm. The fence line at the edge of the Carter pasture, when she looked toward it in the mornings with the specific involuntary attentiveness that she had stopped pretending was mere habit, showed no figure on horseback or on foot. The silence where those small unannounced presences had been was not a loud silence. It was quiet and complete, and it pressed against the places in her that had just against every reasonable instinct begun to open. She told herself it was the correct outcome. She had known with the part of her mind that was not susceptible to the particular alchemy of warm barns and figure-8 knots and hands held in large, careful palms that this was the correct outcome. She was not a person who fit into the Carter Ranch's social world. She was not a person who fit into any world that Elijah Carter needed to maintain for practical reasons, and practical reasons were real reasons, and a man with a ranch and a loan and business relationships had the right to make decisions on the basis of real reasons. She told herself this in the mornings when she built the fire. She told herself this during the deliveries that remained, which she made with her head up and her expression fixed and her spine straight. She told herself this during the evenings when the work was done and the tent was quiet and the river moved in the dark, and she was as she had always been alone with it. And then, on the 8th day after the storm, she stopped telling herself and started doing something instead. She was at the river at her usual hour, the darkness before dawn, working through a washing that included the remaining linens from the clients who had not yet withdrawn their business when she became aware, in the way she always became aware, of changes in her immediate landscape, that she was being watched. She turned. Silas Dowd was on the path behind her, perhaps 20 yards back, standing with his hands in his coat pockets in the posture of a man who has arranged himself to look like he has arrived casually, and wants her to understand that he has not. He was a good-looking man in the specific way of men who have been told they are good-looking often enough that it has become a feature of their character as much as their appearance, and his face, in the early dawn light, was arranged in the expression she remembered from the town square 3 years ago, the expression of a man who finds his own capacity for damage entertaining. "Early morning for laundry," he said. She turned back to her washboard and continued working. This was not indifference. It was a considered tactical choice. "I hear you have been spending time up at the Carter Ranch," he said, moving a little closer on the path. "Bold of you, Clara May. Always thought you had a certain kind of boldness, even if the rest of it was lacking." She wrung out the shirt in her hands with steady, methodical force and laid it in the rinsing basin. She did not look at him. "I have had a conversation with some of Elijah Carter's business associates," Silas continued. "Some of his financial associates. A man in Carter's position cannot afford the kind of talk that follows a woman like you. I expect you understand that. I expect that is why you have not seen much of him this week." She picked up the next piece of washing from the pile and set it against the board and began to work. "The sensible thing," Silas said, and he was closer now, close enough that she could hear him clearly over the sound of the river, "would be for you to take yourself out of the equation. Red Hollow Valley has never suited you, Clara May. It never will. A woman who knows her limitations makes better use of herself somewhere else." She stopped working. She did not turn around. She stood with her hands in the cold water, and she breathed in and out slowly and carefully through the specific quality of rage that she rarely allowed herself to feel and was feeling, now not the hot combustible rage of a person who has been insulted, but the deeper, colder rage of a person who has been reminded deliberately and with intent of every loss they have carried and every defeat they have accepted by the person most responsible for the worst of them. She turned to face him. He was perhaps 12 feet away, and he had the expression of a man who is confident in his position. And she looked at him for a long moment, long enough that something in his expression shifted very slightly. Some of the confidence losing its easy, settled quality and becoming something that required a little more effort to maintain. "You have said what you came to say," she said, and her voice was level and quiet and entirely without the tremor she had half expected to find in it. "Now you can go." "Clara," he started. "Go," she said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It had behind it the weight of 3 years of everything she had not said to him, not in the square, and not in the weeks after, and not in every moment on the main street when she had maintained her careful blankness, and he heard that weight. She saw him hear it. She saw his expression complete, its adjustment from confidence to something that was closer to the expression of a person who has pushed something and found that it pushes back. He left. He turned and walked back along the river path, and she watched him go with her hands still in the cold water and her chest rising and falling with the careful, deliberate breathing of someone managing a significant internal event. And when he was out of sight, she stood there for a long moment in the growing dawn light. That was Wednesday. On Thursday morning, she began to pack. She did not make the decision in a single moment. It accumulated through the hours of Wednesday night, assembling itself from the evidence, 2 lost clients, a week of silence. From the fence line, Silas's visit at the river, and the clear, unambiguous logic of a situation in which her continued presence in Red Hollow Valley was costing someone she did not want to cost anything. The logic was the same logic she had applied for 3 years to her own life. The logic of a woman who had learned to make herself small enough that her existence did not inconvenience the world more than necessary. It was terrible logic. She knew it was terrible logic. She applied it anyway because the alternative was to believe that she was worth the cost, and that belief required a foundation she was not yet sure she had. She packed the things she could carry in the wagon she did not own, but could rent from the livery for the first day's travel south, where there was a larger town and laundry work to be found, and a clean start that would cost her everything she had built here, and would allow Elijah Carter to manage his loan and his business relationships without her name attached to his. She packed her needle case and her good shears and the receipt book and the small tin of sheep salve she had not consciously decided to keep. She packed in the dead hours before dawn, when the darkness was total and the valley was silent, and she did not cry while she packed, because she had not cried in front of anyone in 3 years, and she was not going to start crying alone, because crying alone was worse. She was almost finished when she heard the horse. The sound of hooves on frozen ground carried differently in the deep cold of pre-dawn cleaner, and more precise than in other seasons, each strike of iron against earth, arriving in the stillness with a clarity that made distance difficult to judge. Clara heard the horse before she saw it, and she stood in the entrance of the half-dismantled tent with the bundle of her needle case and receipt book held against her chest, and she listened to the sound coming closer along the river path with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they are not sure they are actually hearing. Then the lantern light resolved itself out of the darkness, a single flame moving at the height of a man on horseback, and she understood that she was hearing it, and that it was real, and that it was coming toward her camp at a pace that was not the casual pace of someone passing through, but the deliberate pace of someone who knows where they are going and is going there with intention. He came around the stand of scrub willows and pulled the dark horse up at the edge of her camp, and the lantern light caught the familiar planes of his face beneath the hat brim, and he looked at the half-packed wagon and the dismantled tent framing and the bundles assembled near the wagon bed, and he looked at her and he said nothing for a long moment. She did not say anything either. She stood with her bundle and her straight spine and her carefully assembled expression, and she waited. Because there was nothing to say that the scene had not already communicated, and because she was underneath the assembly of her composure somewhere between terrified and something she did not have a name for. That was not entirely unlike the feeling of a person standing at the edge of a high place looking down, understanding that what comes next is either a fall or a flight, and not yet knowing which. He dismounted. He tied the horse to the nearest cottonwood with a single efficient movement, and he crossed the space between the tree and her tent entrance, and he stopped when he was close enough that the lantern he carried threw its light across both of them, and he looked at her with the direct, unguarded attention that she had been trying to protect herself from since the tack room, since the salve, and the hands, and the figure-8 knot. And he said, "Where are you going?" It was not phrased as a question, or not entirely as a question. It had the quality of something that already knew the answer, and was asking anyway because the asking was part of what needed to happen. "South," she said. "There is work in Millhaven, laundry work. I have done it before." Clara. Elijah. She said his name the way she had not said it before, not in the careful neutral mode of minimal social exchange, but directly, and the directness of it seemed to surprise them both slightly, a crack in the careful register she had been maintaining. "You know why I am going. You are not a man who requires things explained that are already plain." "Then explain it anyway," he said, "because I want to hear it in your words, not in the version I have already heard." She looked at him. She looked at the lantern light between them, at the bundles in the wagon, at the flattened snow where the tent stakes had been driven into the ground for 3 winters and had now been pulled up. She had not thought about those stake holes when she was pulling them. She thought about them now, the 3 years of those specific marks in the earth, and something in her chest moved in a way she was running out of mechanisms to suppress. "You have a loan to service," she said. "You have business relationships and a standing in this valley that took years to build and that can be damaged by association with the wrong kind of person. I am the wrong kind of person. Not because of anything I have done, but because of what I am and what I look like, and where I live, and whose name has been attached to mine, by someone who has a vested interest in making sure I cannot go anywhere in this valley without dragging trouble behind me." She stopped. She took a breath. "I will not be that for you. I will not be the thing that costs you what you built. You came out into a blizzard for me, and you warmed my hands, and you walked me to the fence line, and you sent a man to dig out my wood stack, and I will not repay that by being the reason Harlan Phelps calls in your note." The silence after she finished was the specific silence of a space that has been waiting for something to be said and has now received it. Elijah stood in that silence for a moment, and she could see him receiving what she had said, not dismissing it, not moving to counter it, before he had heard it fully, which was his way, the way of a man who takes information seriously enough to actually absorb it before he responds. Then he reached out, and with the same matter-of-fact directness with which he had taken her hands in the tack room, he took the bundle she was holding against her chest and set it down on top of the nearest packed box gently and deliberately, and she was left standing with her arms no longer occupied, which was a more vulnerable position than she had been in a moment ago, and she suspected he understood this. "Harlan Phelps," he said, "had a conversation with my lawyer this morning. The loan will be refinanced with the bank in the county seat. Phelps no longer holds the note." She stared at him. "That is," she said slowly, "not a small undertaking." "No," he agreed. "You did that." "My lawyer did it. I made the decision." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the scale of what he was saying, the deliberate, practical, irrevocable nature of the action, the fact that it was not a gesture or a speech, but a legal and financial reorganization of a significant piece of his business life, conducted with the same quiet efficiency with which he approached every other problem in his world. "The Cattlemen's Association," she said. "I tendered my resignation from the committee this afternoon. I remain a member. The committee does not run my ranch, and it does not run my life, and I should have said so more clearly when they came to me, and I did not. And that is the only thing in the last week that I am not satisfied with. She looked at him in the lantern light, at his face that was so consistently, almost unreasonably honest in its expression, and she felt the carefully maintained architecture of her plan begin to do what careful architectures do when the conditions that necessitated them change, which is to say, it began to come apart. "Elijah," she said, and her voice had lost some of its careful flatness, "you are describing a great deal of disruption on behalf of a woman who washes laundry in a canvas tent on the riverbank." "I am describing a reasonable response," he said, "to the discovery that I had let other people make decisions about my life that were mine to make." He paused, and something in the economy of his expression shifted, not dramatically, because he was not a dramatic man, but perceptibly the way a landscape shifts when the light changes. "And I am describing what I should have done a week ago, instead of letting the silence go on as long as it did. That is also something I am not satisfied with." She felt the back of her eyes do the thing they had been doing at intervals since the tack room, the pressure of something that had no other means of egress, and she addressed it in the usual way by looking at a fixed point, which was the lantern flame between them. "I watched you from the fence line," he said, and the directness in his voice was the same directness he applied to everything, but it was quieter now, stripped of the transactional brevity he used when the subject was barn doors or frozen paths. "I have watched you for the better part of 2 years. I have watched you carry things that most people in this valley would have put down a long time ago, and carry them without complaint and without asking for anything from anyone. I spliced your clothesline because you needed it done, and I could do it, and because watching you hang your washing on the tent frame in November was not something I could continue to do. And I cut the wood because a woman working until midnight in a tent with an empty woodpile in October is a problem that has a simple solution if a person is willing to apply it." He stopped. He looked at her directly. "I did not say any of that to you when I should have," he said, "because I was not sure of my welcome. And I am a man who moves carefully when he is not sure of his ground. That is a reasonable approach to most problems. In this case, the caution let other people move into the space I left, and that will not happen again." Clara stood in the lantern light, and in the cold pre-dawn dark of a valley, she had told herself she was leaving, and she looked at this man who had walked out into a mountain blizzard to find her, and had not carried her like a trophy, but had walked beside her through the drifts, and called it nothing, and she felt the last defensible position of the argument she had been making to herself for the past week collapse with the quiet, total finality of a structure that has lost its load-bearing element. "I am not a simple addition to a man's life," she said, and she needed him to understand this, needed it with an urgency that had nothing to do with warning him off, and everything to do with being fully seen before she allowed herself to be fully present. "I am not small, and I am not easy, and I carry a great deal that does not simply put itself down because circumstances improve. I have been told by enough people, including people who were supposed to love me, that I am too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones, and I have spent 3 years building a life on the premise that the verdict was correct, and that the correct response was to make myself as contained and as inoffensive as possible." She stopped. She breathed. "I do not know," she said, "how to be chosen. I am not sure I believe in it when it is in front of me. You should know that." "I know it," he said, "and you are not discouraged." "No." He said it with the simplest possible conviction, the conviction of a man who has made a decision on the basis of thorough observation over a significant period of time, and is not in the habit of second-guessing decisions that have been properly made. "I do not need a woman who has already been shaped into what the town finds convenient. I need a woman with the sense to read a bad sky and the strength to walk through a blizzard, and the honesty to tell me the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient. You have been every one of those things since the first morning I watched you work at that river before the sun was up." He moved forward one deliberate step, and he reached out and took her hands from where she had crossed them against her chest, and he held them in both of his the way he had in the tack room, with the same warmth and the same complete absence of apology for the gesture. "I am not asking you to be easy, Clara. I am asking you to stay." The lantern flame moved between them in the slight pre-dawn wind coming off the river, and the horses in the distance at the Carter barn would soon need their morning attention, and the valley around them was the blue and white silence of a world still mostly asleep. And Clara May Whitlock stood in that silence with her hands held in the hands of a man who had read her correctly from a fence line at a distance for 2 years, and she made the decision that was the most frightening decision she had made since she had decided 3 years ago to stay in Red Hollow Valley after the town square, and the laughter and the basket of preserves, except that this decision moved in the opposite direction from that one towards something rather than away, which was a direction she had almost entirely stopped traveling in. "All right," she said. He did not whoop or gesture or smile in the broad, demonstrative way of a man in a story who has gotten the answer he wanted. He held her hands and he looked at her, and what moved across his face was the quiet, settled expression of a man who has been waiting a careful, patient time for a particular outcome, and has now received it and is absorbing it properly. He nodded once the way he acknowledged everything that was real and received and did not require performance. Then he said practically, because he was a practical man, in all conditions, "The wagon is already loaded. I will unpack it in the morning." She almost laughed. She did not laugh, but the almost was closer to the surface than it had been in a long time, and she thought he saw it because something in the set of his mouth acknowledged it without commentary. They stood at the river for a while longer in the dark, and the water moved beneath its partial skin of ice with the slow, patient sound of something that intends to keep moving regardless of the season, and Clara felt for the first time in 3 years the specific, terrifying, necessary sensation of a person who has stopped organizing their life entirely around the management of loss. The following Sunday came in cold and clear with the hard blue sky of deep autumn, and the mountains sharp against it to the north. The kind of morning that Red Hollow Valley produced after its worst weather, as though in compensation. A morning so clean and bright that the world seemed newly made, and the prior week's storm seemed like something that had happened in a different version of the same place. Clara had made a dress. She had made it in the 3 days between the river and Sunday, not from new fabric, because new fabric was not among her current resources, but from a length of good deep green wool she had been keeping folded at the bottom of her trunk for 2 years, saving it for an occasion that had not seemed likely to arrive. It was not an elaborate dress. She did not have the time or the intention for elaborate. It was a well-made dress cut simply, and sewn with the same precision and care that characterized everything she made, with her hands fitted correctly to the body she actually had, rather than the body that might have been considered more convenient with a collar that lay flat and cuffs that sat square at her wrists. She had ironed it herself on the evening before and hung it on the tent frame overnight, and when she put it on Sunday morning in the cold, clear light coming through the tent canvas, it was the dress of a woman who had made something of quality from what she had, which was, she thought, an accurate representation. Elijah arrived at the camp in his finest carriage at 8:30 in the morning, which was earlier than church required, but which gave them sufficient time to make the drive at a pace that was not hurried. He drove it himself without a ranch hand on the box, which was a decision she understood. He wore a dark coat that was brushed clean and a hat that had been blocked recently, and he stepped down from the carriage box and came to where she was standing outside the tent with her coat over her arm and her hat pinned. And he looked at her in the morning light without the furtive sideways quality that most people brought to the act of looking at Clara May Whitlock directly and without apology or performance. "You made that," he said, and it was not a question. "This week," she said. He nodded. He held out his hand and helped her up to the carriage seat, which was not an act she required assistance for, but which was the gesture of a man who understood that the offering of assistance and the requiring of it were different things, and she took his hand and stepped up and settled on the seat, and he returned to the box and took up the reins, and they drove into Red Hollow Valley on a clear Sunday morning in late autumn. She had thought she would feel more of what she felt on the main street 3 years ago, the bracing, the assembly of defenses, the careful arrangement of a face designed to communicate imperviousness. Instead, she felt something different, something that was not indifference to what people thought, but was something adjacent to it, the specific quality of a person who has decided that the opinion of those who wish them diminished is not a currency she is willing to spend herself managing. The church was set on a slight rise at the center of the town, with steps that faced the main street, and a yard where the congregation gathered before and after the service. By the time Elijah drove the carriage up the street and brought it to a stop at the base of those steps, there were perhaps 30 people in the yard and on the steps themselves, the usual gathering of a Sunday morning in a community where church attendance was as much a social function as a spiritual one. She was aware in the particular alertness of a woman who has lived in this town for long enough to read its social temperature accurately of the way the yard adjusted itself to their arrival. She was aware of the heads that turned, and the conversations that paused, and the specific quality of the attention that the assembled congregation directed toward the carriage. She was aware of all of it with a clarity that was almost interesting in its detachment, as though she were watching it from a moderate distance, rather than moving through it. Elijah came around to her side of the carriage and held up his hand, and she took it and stepped down, and they went up the steps together side by side, at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberate, simply the pace of two people going somewhere they intend to be. She saw her mother first. Eleanor Whitlock was standing near the top of the steps with her regular Sunday companions, and she saw Clara at the same moment Clara saw her, and the expression that moved across her mother's face was complicated in the way that the expressions of people who have done damage and not reckoned with it become complicated when the damage turns out to have been survived. Clara looked at her mother for a moment directly and without heat, and she did not stop walking. She saw Silas second. He was near the church door with Annalise, who was small and fine-boned, and who wore, Clara noticed, with something that was not quite pity, but was in its neighborhood the expression of a woman who has had enough time to understand her husband's character and is not entirely at peace with what she understands. Silas watched Clara come up the steps with Elijah Carter beside her, and the expression on his face moved through several iterations in a short period, beginning with the smirking confidence that was his default, and moving through something less comfortable, and settling on something that was simply the expression of a man who has run a calculation and does not entirely like the result. Clara did not stop. She did not look at him long enough to give the looking any significance. She walked past him with her head at the same level it had been at the bottom of the steps, and she did not provide the speech or the confrontation or the public moment of reckoning that perhaps some part of the watching congregation had arranged itself to witness. There was nothing to say to Silas Dowd that the morning had not already said more eloquently than words. They went through the church door, and they took a pew, and the service began. It was an ordinary service, which was exactly what it should have been. Scripture and singing and the Reverend's voice moving through the familiar rhythms of a Sunday morning in a valley community. And Clara sat in the pew and listened, and was present in a way she had not been present in a church in Red Hollow Valley in a very long time. Without the sideways vigilance, without the maintenance of the careful blankness, without the ongoing calculation of exits and angles. Elijah sat beside her with the settled, unhurried quality that he carried everywhere. And at some point during the service, his hand moved to cover hers where it rested on her knee. Not dramatically, not with the declarative force of a gesture designed to be observed simply. The quiet placement of one hand over another, the gesture of a person establishing a fact rather than making a statement. She did not move her hand. In the weeks that followed, the social arithmetic of Red Hollow Valley did what social arithmetics do when a clear, uncomplicated fact presents itself consistently and without apology over a sustained period of time, which is to say it gradually adjusted itself around the fact rather than continuing to spend energy contesting it. There were people who did not adjust. Mrs. Alderman removed her account permanently and replaced it with someone from the far end of the valley, and Silas Dowd maintained his posture of contemptuous amusement in public spaces with the dedicated effort of a man for whom the posture had become load-bearing in his own self-construction. Clara noticed these things, and they registered as what they were, which was not her problem. She had learned to distinguish between things that were her problem and things that had only been her problem because she had accepted them as such, and this distinction, simple as it sounded, was in practice the most significant change in her interior landscape since the morning she had walked out of the town square with her back straight. The tent came down in December. Not because it was uninhabitable, it had been her home for 3 winters, and she had made it work, but because Elijah had proposed in his characteristic fashion, not with ceremony or rehearsed language, but with the direct practical honesty that was the consistent register of everything he said to her. He had said that he had been running the ranch alone for long enough, and that the ranch house had rooms that were not being used, and that he wanted her to be his wife, not to fill those rooms, or because the arrangement was practical, though it was, but because he had watched her for 2 years from a fence line and had walked with her through a blizzard and had held her hands in a warm tack room, and a man who had seen what he had seen in the person standing in front of him and did not act on it was a man who deserved to spend the rest of his life regretting it. She had said yes. She had said it in the same direct, unornamented way in which he had asked without qualification or extended deliberation, because she had done her deliberating already in the long months of the fence line and the firewood and the repaired clothesline in the night of the blizzard and the morning after in the week of silence and the pre-dawn dark of the river path when she had been packing to leave, and he had come out of the dark on horseback with a lantern. The ranch house was large, and it was not entirely warm in all its rooms in December, and there was more work in it than she had anticipated, which was to say a great deal of work, which was to say it was exactly the kind of challenge she was built for, and she moved through it with the same systematic competence she brought to everything she undertook. Elijah watched her reorganize the kitchen stores and approved, without commentary, and she watched him manage the winter ranch work and understood from the specificity of his attention to every element of it why the Carter Ranch was what it was in the valley. They were, it turned out, people who made sense beside each other. Not in the smooth, effortless way of a story that requires no friction, because friction is unpleasant to contemplate, but in the specific, honest way of 2 people who have both carried significant things alone for a long time, and who discover with something between relief and astonishment that the carrying is different when there is someone beside you who does not require you to pretend the weight is nothing. She hung her needle case in the kitchen of the ranch house on a nail near the window where the morning light was best for close work, and she brought the tin of sheep salve from the trunk where she had packed it the night of the river, and she set it on the windowsill. Elijah saw it there and said nothing, and the not saying was the understanding of a man who knows the significance of a small object and respects it. On the morning of the first real spring day, the kind of morning that comes in the mountains with a particular, insistent warmth that announces something has shifted for good, she walked to the fence line at the edge of the pasture and looked out across the land that stretched to the river, which was running full and fast with the snow-melt silver in the early light, and she stood in the morning and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who has survived the specific winters the world designed for her and arrived without entirely planning to somewhere she was allowed to be warm. Elijah came up beside her after a while because he generally knew where she was and generally came to where she was without making an occasion of it, and they stood together at the fence line where he had watched her from a distance for 2 years and looked at the river and the light on it, and he did not say anything sentimental because he was not a sentimental man, and she did not say anything either because she did not need to. The river ran on below them, clear and cold and continuous, the way rivers run in mountain valleys, through every season, through every storm and every silence, carrying everything forward without stopping to explain itself to anyone. She had lived beside that river for 3 years and had thought it was holding her in place. And she understood now in the way that understanding sometimes comes only after you have moved away from a thing and can see it whole, that it had been moving her towards something all along. She put her hand on the fence post beside his, and the morning light came across the pasture, and the valley was alive with the particular unsentimental beauty of a world that does not concern itself with the suffering of the people in it, but continues to be beautiful regardless, which it always seemed to her like either a cruelty or a kind of grace, and which she was inclined, on this particular morning, to call the latter.